We're going to look at the business merits of agricultural trade. This was an invited paper that I was asked to do for the Agricultural Symposium of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City in the summer of 2018. And so typically when you're invited to a paper, you put a lot of thought into something thinking about trade, and they asked if I would do that and try to visit with agricultural lenders and so forth. And you've got a copy of that in Canvas, and here's the citation for what I'm going to go through today for that paper. We've talked in this class about marketing channels, supply chains, value chains. Logistics is in that paper. It just talks about the process of getting things from point A to point B. Two other things to think about as we think about today's lecture. The law of comparative advantage, which says that the ability of any producer to produce goods and services at a lower opportunity cost than a producer gives that person a comparative advantage. And typically we think about these relative to countries. And then as we think about global, so starting with the 1996 Farm Bill, we really encouraged producers to realize they were in a global market. And a lot of these global supply chains started after the mid-1990s. So as the U.S. producer thinks about global economic opportunities, by definition, there is an increase in risk. And a lot of this risk is around how do you get things from A to B, what's the process, and then the other part of that risk is exchange rate risk. So I'm going to structure this thinking about annual crops. These are things like corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, things we're very familiar with. Perennial crops, orchard crops, nut crops, those type of things. Meat and poultry, and then dairy. Again, not every producer is going to be available if they want to take advantage of the export markets. There's a high desire by importers of U.S. products to understand where their food comes from. And so if you want to be part of that process, for example, if I want to sell blueberries from Oregon into South Korea, there's a lot of things you've got to go through. You've got to have fences to keep the deer out of your blueberry orchard. You've got to be able to document the chemicals, the crop protectants and fungicides you're using. You have to allow people to visit. You have to allow buyers to come out and visit your operation. Not every grower wants to do that, and that's okay. So we've got different supply chains that we've talked about in this class, different supply chains that are compiling with what these supply chain captains want in their products. So why have these supply chains and value chains developed? Since the mid-1990s, we've seen huge communication systems allowing better tracking of quality and so forth. You've heard no doubt about blockchain. And basically, it's what the spreadsheets, if you will, on the internet with protected cells, if you think about that. Huge interest in terms of how do we get things off of ships and onto rail or trucks, cold chain, reefer boxes, and so forth. How do we get that done? How do we get things off an airplane, for example, in the port of Miami or off a boat, get them inspected, and then get them to a FedEx or UPS or a truck or however it's going to be delivered into the interior part of the United States. It's amazing what's happened to our supply chains. We're doing a much better job with humidity control, atmospheric packaging, all kinds of things to allow us to use ocean shipping to bring things in from these global food chains. Packaging innovations, coatings on fruits and vegetables to help them avoid bruising and last longer, genetic modification, and other techniques that will help extend the shelf life. And then finally, there's been if you look at cranes, I've been to a number of ports around the world, and it's just amazing what's happened with cranes and just how do we get things off of ships. If you're really interested, go to YouTube and just start looking at crane capacity and look at how we load in ships in Brazil versus how we do in the United States versus we do in the port of Odessa in Ukraine. It's much different. It's really interesting to see then how do we get those on the highways and rail connections. And then we've got custom inspection services. We're in the process of implementing FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and there's a number of things that become more efficient and timely from a food safety perspective. We believe that in the United States we have the world's best and most modern food safety system, so we want people that are trading with us to use our standards in working through their value chains. We've talked a bit about this graph in class, the different types of global value chain governance systems, but what we're seeing is increasingly a movement, not to full integration, but we're moving to these chain captains, which are dictating what the rest of the chain looks like. Trade agreements. We have 20 different trade agreements that we've signed with other countries. And sometimes people get focused on one aspect of those. But if you look very carefully in the back part of these, we're imposing our food safety, risk assessment notifications on the signees of these agreements. And in recent years, we've gone even to labor and environmental impacts. So we have many, 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 many benefits to food consumers and producers through our trade agreements, especially with the part relating to food. What are some current issues that impact the supply and value chains in global agricultural trade? Global trademarks, certification marks, and geographic indications. The Digital Media project you're doing for this class is taking one of these particular products and analyzing it. The difference between animal of origin versus farm of origin versus country of origin. It's really interesting when you start looking at this whole issue of farm of origin versus animal of origin. Does the animal have to have an ear tag, for example? Do we have to just track it from the farm, from the pen of animals? Or do we just track it by country? All of those are different things when it comes to traceability. And different countries have got different laws on that. SPS is sanitary and phytosanitary issues. These are things like when we had the avian flu. The avian flu doesn't hurt humans, but does hurt other animals. And so we were able to get timely resolution of what the avian flu was in 2015 and 2016 in turkeys, and that allowed us to trade Minnesota turkey meat from certain counties overseas. Global price risk, that's the most difficult thing, right? So think about a company like General Mills, in which something like 10% of their sales is done overseas. General Mills has got yogurt. They've got ice cream. They're buying fluid milk to make all of these different products. What they really want is global price risk protection for things related to fluid milk in their supply chain. We don't have very good mechanisms for doing that. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is within a country, we may have global price risk through futures exchanges or contracts and so forth. It's much more difficult in the context of a global supply chain. Another current thing in 2018 is compliance enforcement of the Buy American and the school nutrition programs. The school nutrition programs state that wherever possible, where it's cost effective, you should be buying things like canned peaches and canned pears and frozen fruits and vegetables that were made in the United States as opposed to importing them from China. One of the things we've observed is we've got companies from overseas that are buying U.S. brands. Sometimes they call these distressed brands, but they're buying those brands of putting foreign product, if you will, in those branded products, and then people are confused by what they're buying. And so to abide by the law, we've got to have, we have this act that Congress put in there to Buy American and the school nutrition programs. We've got to make sure that that's what they're buying. We've got organizational structure issues. We've talked about cooperatives in this class. Cooperatives do a very good job within a country. Sometimes they're not always the best structure when you're looking at across countries. Cooperatives in general do a very good job pooling average producers' volume and trying to find a home for all of that. Historically, they have not done as good a job in terms of research and development. There are exceptions, but sometimes their organizational structure doesn't give them the capital they need to do some of the things we want to have done. We've got implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, which is ongoing right now, but basically now with these supply chains, growers in countries like Mexico or Peru or Central America, they've got to abide by the same labor and water quality and other things, just like a U.S. producer has if we're going to import their and make them part of a global supply chain. So food safety, FSMA, you'll be reading about the implementation of this for the next several years. And then we got unforeseen policy decisions, right? So the Russians invade Ukraine, they take over Crimea, and they create dissent in eastern Ukraine. The European Union then says, okay, we don't like what you did, so we're going to, impose some visa restrictions. And then what does Russia do in 2013? They say, hey, we're not going to buy any food from Western Europe. Well, we had 2013, 2014, we had dairy farmers and their cooperatives and firms in Western Europe that were producing dairy products to export into Russia. And when Russia said, no, we're not going to take your products, those cooperatives and companies then had trouble trying to find homes for those products when important. So we have these policy decisions with a tariff war in the summer of 2018 on soybeans. These are things that people can't foresee, And so they're very difficult to predict, and they all have implications on producers. What are some implications for stakeholders in these value chains? So lenders, as they finance production and agriculture assets that are contingent upon exports, for example, a California dairy industry that was going to produce milk, dry it, and then ship it to Eastern Asian countries, you've got a degree of risk that you don't fully understand sometimes, because exchange rate matters, because of a number of things. Other countries start growing their dairy industry, and they may not want U.S. imports coming to their country. Fluctuation of exchange rates, lack of transparent information on future supplies. As much as we would like to say that we've got all this information out there, sometimes it's very difficult to forecast a man on what's going on. So if you think about what's happened in recent years, for example, the demise of the milk quotas in the European Union in 2015, everyone thought, oh, okay, I can put more cows on my farm in the European Union countries. Well, the same thing is going on in North America, and Australia, and China. Globally, every farmer is adding more cows. It doesn't take much more milk to depress the whole entire global industry for milk, and then you got to find homes for all this dried milk. You know, at some point, the dried milk gets old enough, it becomes dog food. And so as we think about all this, we don't have a good understanding of what's going on globally sometimes, an individual farmer, and what they're doing, how that impacts things globally. We make loans for fruit, nut, and vineyards, things like olive and wine. These are really, really long-term investments. And if they're designed for the export market, we've really got to understand what's going on, for example, in wine production. So Argentina, out by Mendoza, it says we're going to have an export industry for wine. Well, typically, importers of Argentinian wine, for example, here in the United States, we're importing wine with certain grapes from Argentina. But the bulk generic wine from Argentina is not something we're going to consume. So Argentina has to grow their own domestic wine consumption in order to be able to export wine. And that's a common export strategy. New Zealanders can't export high-value cuts of lamb unless the domestic population consumes large amounts of lamb, things like lamb burgers and so forth, which in fact they do. So as we think about we've got this concept called fixed proportions in agriculture. An animal's got 4 legs. It's only got so many pounds of hamburgers. It's only got so many pounds of steaks on a cow. We've got to find a home for all of those products. And if the export markets only want the quote-unquote higher valued stuff, we've got to find a home for all those other things, and typically that's in the domestic market for those type products. I talked a bit about the dairy industry in Eastern Europe. Corn ethanol, we were exporting. China had become our 3rd largest destination for corn ethanol, and then the Chinese decided January 1st of 2017 they weren't going to take anymore. They were going to start producing corn ethanol themselves and import corn from the United States and South America. That was a policy decision they made. That took away an important market for corn ethanol. I talked a bit about the dairy industry. We've got risks that we don't know going forward. How fast is plant-based meat and lab-based meat going to take off? And I've got another lecture talking about that. What's going to happen with aquaculture? What's going to happen with geographic diversification of fruit and nuts? So California right now is the world leader in fruits and nuts, but we're going to see that industry probably rebuilt in Central Asia. We're going to see China and other areas start adding fruits and nuts. What does that mean as we see these grown in other parts of the world? We don't know what electric cars will do, what that will do to exchange rates and transportation and so forth. And it's highly likely we're going to have something called economic obsolescence or stranded capital. So it may be that we make a bet on technology, like conventional meat, and all of a sudden if plant-based meat or lab-based meat takes off, we may have a meat slaughter plant that we can't use. And so as we think about economic obsolescence and stranded capital, as part of this global supply chain issue, we may see stranded assets at some point in these supply chains. So there's a lot of advantages for trade. We can't feed the world without global trade. There's a lot of merit in trading products agriculturally. But you've really got to understand the supply chains and what's going on and how they changed in the middle 1990s.